Just giving an explanation. Can you just say something, Shaykh?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I'm just talking randomly. This is not yet the class. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallama tasliman kathira. Bismillah, just a sound check. Is this way too loud?
I think that's what, yeah. I thought it would mind.
It is kind of cold.
You,
My video.
you're frozen?
Let me see.
No.
Al-Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد حبيب رب العالمين وعلى آله وأصحابه والتابعين لهم بإحسان وهدى إلى يوم الدين. Alhamdulillah, in our second session on Zakat, we're going to be looking at the actual paying of Zakat. We mentioned that over 2 lessons we're going to cover Zakat in 4 aspects. So last class we looked at the legal basis of Zakat and we looked at the inner dimensions of Zakat. Today we're going to look at the Fiqh of Zakat, how you pay Zakat. And through that we'll look at some of the common questions and issues that arise. So just to begin with a review, we saw in the last class that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not simply command us to pay zakat, but He also commanded us, He also commanded us with respect to the specifics of how zakat is given. But zakat is not simply an act in which we just fulfill the divine command alone. There is an underlying purpose and benefit that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has informed us of. That what is the benefit of zakat? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah At-Tawbah, verse 103, خُذْ مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ صَدَقَةً تُطَهِّرُهُمْ وَتُزَكِّيهِمْ بِهَا. Take from their wealth a charity that will purify them and increase them or refine them. And we looked at these two related terms of purification, tahara, and spiritual increase or tazkiyah. Can also be translated as refinement. And if you don't remember the relationship between these two terms, do go and look back on it because they're very significant. We also saw verse 60 of Surah At-Tawbah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about whom zakat is given to. But there's a few central principles there, the first of which is that zakat must be given. Right? Zakat must be given. And we look at the legal implications of that. And that there are specific categories of eligible zakat recipients. Zakat is a specific religious charity given to specific people in specific ways if specific conditions are fulfilled. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also tells us about the consequences of not paying zakat, highlighting both the underlying motive for the withholding of giving, right, which is bukhl, right, bukhl, which is miserliness, or that desire to hoard, right, that inclination to hoard, right? And this is one of the basic human shortcomings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warns us about throughout the Quran. One of the surahs to really reflect upon, particularly as you grow older, because you get more and more attached to worldly matters, is Surah At-Takathur, right? Because wealth seems, wealth looks real. And as your life is fleeting, you want to hold on to it even more. And because when you're young, there's still time. But now you fear, once you are getting late in your middle age, now you're worried that, well, I don't have the same kind of job mobility because I have family. If I'm 37, which I'm not, if I lose my job, will I be hired as easily as someone who's 24? All these worries, what about retirement, etc. So you latch on to these things that seem real. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, أَلْهَاكُمُ التَّكَاثُرُ, right? You have been busied away by your amassing of wealth, right? That desire of increasing. حَتَّى زُرْتُمُ الْمَقَابِرِ, until you visit your graves. Right? And this visit is a permanent visit. Once you're there, you're not coming back. كَلَّا سَوْفَ تَعْلَمُونَ, indeed you will come to know. Right? Right? ثُمَّ كَلَّا سَوْفَ تَعْلَمُونَ. And that's a surah to really reflect upon. And this underlying quality of bukhl points to, of miserliness, points to one of the purposes of zakat. That zakat not just purifies one's wealth, but it also purifies one's heart from traits that are blameworthy, that are odious to Allah, that distance one from Allah and disadvantage one in one's eternal standing with Him. But that's a specific trait that zakat, those specific traits that zakat deals with, but charity has a broader purificatory potential, right? Charity has a broader purificatory potential as well. And we saw that one of the things to do if you want to attain some benefit yourself is to try to benefit others, which is why it's a broad sunnah that before, if you have some need that you want to have fulfilled, that you should give in charity, because Allah is in the aid of His servant as long as His servant is in the aid of others. So for example, if you have an exam coming up, a good thing to do is before the exam, give in charity, seeking divine facilitation. Someone is sick, you give in charity, right? Because there's this relationship. As you are with your Lord and with your Lord's creation, so shall you find manifest in your Lord's dealing with you, right? And when verses like this are mentioned, right, it's a good habit if you're a seeker of knowledge to make it a habit to always go back and try to look up the tafsir of those verses. And that's always something that a seeker of knowledge should do. And likewise, other things that are quoted. Right? You make a mental note that let me look that up. And some things you may not be able to look up right away. So for example, I could tell you, and I was tempted to, but I will now, that one of the really beautiful discussions of Surah Al-Takathur is in a book by Muhammad Asad, who was of Austrian origin, from a Jewish family, who became Muslim. And it's a beautiful journey. And one of the things that got him thinking about converting was when he was reminded of this surah of the Quran, Surah Al-Takathur. Right? So now, right now, you may not be in a position where you might read this book right away, but you make a note of those things. That book it's one of the most beautiful books you could read, The Road to Mecca by Muhammad Asad. So you make a note of it. You should keep a religious to-do list, of books to read, things to look up, questions you have to ask, and that's one of the ways one has religious concern, right? That what does this surah mention? Similarly about virtues, right? Bukhl is mentioned here, miserliness. So you want to read up more on it, so you make that a to-do list, and it's a good question to ask, and that's part of how one gains a lot of knowledge. The same thing applies in khutbahs. You attended an awful khutbah that was supposed to be about the adab of visiting a masjid, right? But the khutbah went on, basically, it was 7 rants of a random annoyed Muslim, right? So he didn't. So, but you should be left wondering that, well, there's a topic that came up. What are the adab of the masjid? So as soon as the khutbah finishes, you make a note. What are the adab of the masjid? And that's something that you'd like to look up. And that's one of the ways that you can gain a great amount of knowledge. That it's not, you don't only learn through reading from a book from beginning to end, and by study, of attending classes, but also by this active process of always asking and always reflecting. Right? And say, Ibn Abbas was asked, بِمَ نِلْتَ هَذَا الْعِلْمِ? How did you gain all this knowledge? He said, بِلِسَانٍ سَؤُولٍ وَقَلْبٍ عَقُولٍ. By a tongue that was always asking, and by a mind always reflecting. And, and one of the ways is to always ask 2 questions. Right? When it comes to the legal aspects, since we're looking at fiqh, always ask, what is the right way of doing this, and what is the best way of doing this? Right? What's the right way of doing this? That what is the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala regarding this matter? Always ask yourself that question. Right? So for example, you have a habit of, the photocopier, people at work, because now, people don't print as much as they used to 5-10 years ago, right? So much more digitally connected. But, people just go and photocopy. So you're about to photocopy or print out the notes for this class at work. So you ask yourself, firstly, what is the right and wrong of this matter? Okay? And secondly, you always ask yourself, what is the most virtuous way of doing something? What is the best way? What is the sunnah of doing this? Anything. You go to lunch. You ask yourself, what are the limits of lunch? Well, if you have a certain lunch break, you should stick to that unless you have permission. You wonder what are other limits related to that, but also what are the virtues? And there's numerous sunnahs related to our lunch break, such as the best food are that which most hands partake of. So you take others for lunch with you. You consider, well, is it worth spending $10, $15 a day on food, or should you bring food as a norm? I could use some of that money in charity, or save it, or 101 other things. So you're always wondering about limits and virtue. Limits and virtue. So we also looked last class at some of the inner dimensions of zakat, to know why you give, that you're giving, seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And how will you seek Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? We touched upon the aspects of that. To give at the right time, to give zakat when it's due, minimally, but also you can give in advance, such as when a manifest need arises. Many of the righteous would give zakat as soon as they acquired some money. There's actually some of the Sahaba who held that you couldn't keep your money overnight. Right? That because they saw the Prophet ﷺ generally didn't. That if he got money, if he had some needs with it, like getting food for his family, etc., the provisions, etc., there's immediate expenses, he'd spend that money, or he'd give it in charity before the night came. Does anyone know which Sahabi it was? One who was most famous, who got actually into strong disagreements with the other companions regarding this matter. He was very upset that why are you hoarding? And of course, their response has to do with zakat, right? That if you couldn't keep money overnight, and then you couldn't keep it for a year, then what would zakat be due on? Right? But who was it? Sayyidina Abu Dharr al-Ghifari. Sayyidina Abu Dharr al-Ghifari. And different people are different, right? The Prophet ﷺ did not nurture identikit Muslims. Right? The Sahaba had their identities, their personal identities, their different cultural and tribal identities. But Sayyidina Abu Dharr, that was a very, very, very precautious opinion, that he didn't keep any money, but other companions as well, and many of the early Muslims, as soon as they earned, they'd give away the zakat on that money, even though it was not due yet. It would be due once the zakat year was over. But as soon as you earn, you give away the 2.5%, for example. That's the minimum zakat. But then, what are you trying to maximize in your wealth? Okay, what are you trying to maximize in your wealth? You're trying to maximize the good, right? So the wealth management of the righteous would be, how do we use the wealth, their earnings and their wealth, and in a manner that would maximize the good in their life, short term and long term. So they would plan on how much charity they would give. Many of the wealthy early Muslims would divide their wealth into thirds, right? A third for themselves and their needs, a third that they would save, and a third that they would give in charity and in ways of good. Right? And that has a precedent from the prophetic practice, because Sayyidina Sa'd when he thought he was going to die, he wanted to give away all his wealth. The Prophet ﷺ said no, right? Reminding him of the rights of his children, right? That for you to leave your children wealthy and meaning free of need and taken care of is better. So he said, what about 2/3? What about a half? What about a third? And the Prophet said a third, and a third is a lot, right? But many took that as a general precedent. Others would have different amounts that they would give in charity, right? And then give in the right way. Give in the right way, both in terms of the amount and how you go about choosing. And we look at some of the sunnahs of giving. And give to the right people. Give to those most needy, those most deserving, those who have most rights over you, those that are most local, those that would be of greatest consequent benefit, right? Those that would be of greatest consequent benefit. And that is a serious religious consideration as well, right? That where would the giving be of greatest ultimate benefit, and you direct your charity in that manner. And then finally, give with the right attitude. Give considering that it is not you who is doing a favor to the one you're giving to, but rather that this is an expression of gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the blessing of wealth and generally for all His blessings. And secondly, out of a sense of gratitude to the one you're giving to, because they are the means for you to seek the pleasure of Allah. Right? They are assisting you in the fulfillment of your good. So it's not like they're doing you, that you're doing them a favor, but really they're doing you a favor. So you should have gratitude to them as such. When someone does you a favor, how do you deal with them? Right? You don't feel that you don't feel a sense of self-satisfaction that they're doing you a favor, but rather you feel gratitude to them. You respect that good that they do, and you express that gratitude in the appropriate ways. And that's meant to open your heart to have appreciation and care for others, which is why one of the sunnahs of giving is to give directly, at least sometimes, and some of one's giving should be direct, in person, right? And it should be meaningful as well. So today we're going to look at the fiqh of zakat itself, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So the text begins by defining what zakat is, right? And this gives a brief definition. We're going to look at a slightly more expanded definition in a second, but that zakat is defined as the transfer of ownership. And this is taken from the verse, إِنَّمَا الصَّدَقَاتُ لِلْفُقَرَاءِ, right? The obligatory charity is to be given to the poor. Right? The lam there is the lam of tamlik, the lam of the transfer of ownership. Right? And also we saw the hadith last class of Sayyidina Mu'adh ibn Jabal when the Prophet ﷺ sent him to, where did he send him to? To Yemen. That it is taken from their wealthy and given to their poor, right? About the zakat. So it's a transfer of ownership of a specified extent of wealth that is specified by the lawgiver, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to a particular person, to particular people with intention. And always, it's very, if you want to understand anything, know its definition. So let's look at a more expanded definition of zakat. Okay. The first aspect is that it is the transfer of ownership. It is the transfer of ownership. So, and there's consequences to that. You can't just waive a debt, for example, for zakat. Of specific wealth. The zakat is only taken on certain things. It's not on all your belongings. There's only certain categories of things that are zakatable. To a poor Muslim. To a poor Muslim. Who is not Hashimi, who is not from the prophetic household, right? Because they're supposed to be supported in a dignified way by if they're poor, through the treasury. Without benefits to the giver. Without benefit to the giver. So you can't, a company can't pay its employees zakat, your salaries through zakat, for example, because that's benefit returning to the giver. Similarly, within families, as we will see, right? The husband can't give his zakat to his wife. Says, okay, use that to buy the groceries, right? Okay, or he's hungry for, the husband's going to the Apple store, so the wife says, look, here's $30 of my zakat, $40, get some Hero Burgers on the way back, right? So without benefit returning to the giver, right? For the sake of Allah, because it's an act of worship, right? So these are 6 aspects of the definition of zakat. So let's look at each of these one by one, right, to understand the definition of zakat. The first is that there has to be transfer of ownership. So you have to give the zakat. The most obvious implication of this is you can't simply waive debts through zakat. If you wanted to do so, you have to do a workaround. So let's say you owe Uncle Jamil $5,000. Uncle Jamil wants to pay his zakat. So he can't just waive that expense. What he can do is he can give that 5,000, right? And then the person can give it back to them, and that way the debt will be clear. But it still has to be given. And that's the first part. The second, that it's given to a poor Muslim. And there's general agreement that zakat is specifically given to a Muslim. And you'd say, why? And part of the reason is that religion is understood to be very central to any people's social reality. Right? So that, and the basis is that each religious community takes care of their needy. Right? That's just the basis, that every religious tradition, a very central value in that religious tradition is that you take care of the poor. Right? Every religious tradition calls you to have concern for the poor. So it's understood that each religious community would take care of their needy, right, with their obligatory charity. As for the non-obligatory charity, one gives it to the needy, whether they're Muslim or they're not Muslim. But this is what it's based on. So if one is in an area, and then we've also saw last class that the charity that is incumbent upon you is both is not just zakat, but is also social obligations. So let's say if your neighbor is not a Muslim and they're desperately needy and you're wealthy and able to assist them, then you're obligated to assist them beyond your zakat requirements. Right? So the zakat, there's 3 things that are entailed by the person being a poor Muslim. Right? The first is that zakat is given to individuals. It's not given to causes. And you can't build masajid or do da'wah or etc. this is the fulfillment of basic human need. And it is given to the poor. And they need to be Muslim. And then above and beyond that, if there's unfulfilled needs, like you're in an area there's poverty, it's a communal obligation on the Muslims to do their part in the alleviation of that poverty. Right? If there's other poor individuals who are needy, particularly if they're immediate to you, your neighbor, someone in your neighborhood, etc. Third, that zakat is on specific types of wealth. Right? It's not on all valuables. It's not just a general wealth tax. So the basis is that zakat is only due on certain types of wealth. Things that are considered to have a meaning of increase. Right? Because, which is in Arabic called numu, right? Increase. Why? Because the zakat, the root meaning of zakat comes from increase, right? From increase. Right? Zakat huwa numu, right? It is that which is given to growth. Money is given to growth. Investment is given to growth. These meanings, gold and silver, are considered to be given to growth. But personal belongings aren't given to growth, which is why zakat is not due on personal belongings, even if they seem very valuable. Do you have to pay zakat on your MacBook Pro? No. Although it might be quite expensive, right? But it does not in itself grow in value, right? It does not, and it's not. These things aren't acquired as normally as things of increase in value, unless you use it as a trade item. Then that's a separate thing, as we'll see. So the basic zakat calculation here, right? Just to look at it quickly, and we'll be expanding on this. That there is a zakatable minimum, and he'll tell us what the zakatable minimum is in a minute. Right? So zakat, your zakat year begins when you own this zakatable minimum. When the zakat year is over, right? And the zakat year in Arabic is called hawl, with a ha. When that zakat year is over, your zakat is due. So there, if you own a net zakatable minimum above and beyond your debts and immediate expenses, right? Because if you have debts that are due, you deduct them. If you have your immediate expenses, you're needy for those immediate expenses. Your rent, your utility bills, your household expenditures, etc. You don't have dental insurance, so you have a root canal to do, so it's going to cost you $2,000, and it's not just something you might be doing, but it's coming up, shortly. So, and it's due on the amount the zakatable amount that you have on the due date. So you have a zakat due date, and it's due on that amount, regardless of when it was acquired. So those are the basic concepts. So and we'll go over that again in a minute, but just to, on specific wealth, but just to clarify when it's due. So someone who's not a Hashimi, meaning someone who's not from the family of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So someone who's from the family of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they're not by default eligible for zakat. The exception is when they are needy and they aren't alternate sources of support for them. In that case, zakat can be given to them as well. And then the fifth aspect of the zakat definition is that no personal benefit would accrue to the person giving it. So broadly, the text tells us a number of categories of people that you cannot give zakat to. The first principle regarding that is that you cannot give it to immediate family. You can't give zakat to your parents, right? Because you benefit directly from them. You give them zakat, then you go on the weekend and you have lunch at their house, etc. So you're benefiting from them, right? And who would parents spend their wealth on? Children. That's the expectation. The fact that in many societies that's no longer the case, that's an aberrance and not the rightful norm. On one's spouse, right? Honey, here's your zakat. Here's $40 zakat. And by the way, on your way back from work, can you pick me up? Pick me up some shawarma, please. Right? Doesn't work that. And children. Right? So you can't give zakat. There's difference of opinion about zakat to one's spouse. In some schools, it is permitted to give zakat to one's spouse, but not in the Hanafi school. There's an indirect aspect of this as well, related not just to zakat, but to charity, that if you give someone financial assistance, you should be careful, right? You gave someone charity, you should be careful not to leverage that as a means of deriving benefit from them, right? So for example, you gave your charity, let's say 2 brothers. Can brothers give charity to each other? Yes, they can. Let's say Farid gives charity, Omar gives charity to Farid, because Farid's still not graduated from university. But then Omar starts demanding favors, explicitly or implicitly from Farid. So, oh, by the way, I need my car washed. I'm tired. Could you wash my car on Saturday? So Farid feels embarrassed because he's being, he's receiving financial assistance from Omar. Right? You don't do those things, right? Because you give charity, إِنَّمَا نُطْعِمُكُمْ لِوَجْهِ اللَّهِ, right? That's the basis, that we only feed you, and likewise we only assist you for the sake of Allah. لَا نُرِيدُ مِنْكُمْ جَزَاءً وَلَا شَكُورًا, right? That we seek no recompense nor thanks from you. So that benefit indirectly, and it wouldn't affect the legal validity necessarily of zakat, would affect or even nullify the reward. And it applies to zakat and charity, is that you don't seek some benefit through it, and also, it is very important, one does not seek thanks from people for it. And that's a careful aspect as well. That when you assist someone, and this applies to charity and even beyond charity, to other assistance, that if you assist and a test that did you assist someone for the sake of Allah, is that you don't expect thanks. But our religion is a religion of balance, right? The one assisting, whether through charity or other worldly assistance, should not expect, let alone demand, any thanks. Why? Because you only do it for the sake of Allah. But the one assisted should go out of their way, not just to thank, but to be expressive of their thankfulness. The Prophet ﷺ said, لا يشكر الله من لا يشكر الناس. And there's a number of hadiths related to that. That whoever is not thankful to people is not thankful to Allah. And thankfulness is not to say thank you. Shukr is not just to say Jazakallah. Right? It is to express your gratitude. It is to express your gratitude. Okay? Which is why in most Arab societies, if you do someone a favor and you just said Jazakallah khair and that's it, they'll feel offended. Because that's not a sufficient expression. Like, you should be expressive of your gratitude. Okay? And the Prophet ﷺ also said that مَنِ اسْتَنَعَ إِلَيْكُمْ مَعْرُوفًا فَكَافِئُوهُ, that if someone does good for you, then recompense them for it. Right? In the way appropriate. And that's not just through words, right? But also through, for example, suitable mention. A suitable mention. Okay? Also through helping them in a suitable way. It may be, if it's like a gift, one reciprocates the gift. But if some other kind of assistance, then one assists them in some other kind of way, as appropriate, given the circumstances. Right? So, but that's the balance of the deen, right? That you should never expect thanks from people, but you should demand thankfulness from yourself with respect to the good that others do. And this is a place where a lot of people make mistakes because you have no right to demand other than what is due to you from other people. And if you want to simplify your life, stick to this principle. Do not demand from others other than what is due to you. Know what is due to you, right? Because there's a lot of social expectations. If you demand according to the social expectations, one, you'll have difficulty in your relationships, and you'll never be content because people will let you down. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that people are zaloom, right? They're given not to give their due, and they're ignorant. And part of the ignorance is zaluman jahula, right? And part of their being ignorant is that they don't recognize the good that others do to them, right? And the person is given to kufran and ni'mah, to the non-recognition of blessing. So if you want to live content, don't expect other than what is rightfully due to you. And you should know what your rights are. Right? And also, so one, it'll simplify your relationships. The people, so-and-so offended me. Well, did they have to do that? No. I went to Toronto and so-and-so didn't visit me. Did they have to visit you? No. Forget about it. And the other aspect is, so one, it'll simplify your relationships, and number two, it'll give you contentment. Right? And it's closer to sincerity. That that you don't seek from other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, and even when it comes to your rights, the asl is that you be easygoing in the fulfillment of those rights, in the seeking of those rights. In the seeking of your obligatory rights, you are easygoing. But when it comes to the giving of the rights of others, you demand both, number one, caution, and number two, excellence in the fulfillment of the rights of the others. That's the way of the believer. Right? So when it comes to, if you give zakat to family, so let's say you sent your zakat to a poor relative overseas. Now when you go, you're going to, let's say you're Egyptian, you're going to Alexandria. So you call, oh, by the way, I'm coming to Alexandria. Now you've been helping them with zakat for the last 5 years. What are they going to do? They're going to go to the airport. They might not have a car, but they'll rent a car and do this, and right. So in those cases, you err on the side of caution. Right? You err on the side of caution that you don't want to benefit, even seek any benefit from them, because they might give you because you gave them. Right? It won't affect the validity of your zakat or your charity, but it could diminish the reward or the fullness of the reward. So the early Muslims used to, if they gave someone in charity, when they were walking down the street, they'd avoid even walking in the shadow of that person's house, because they didn't want to derive any benefit from that. Now that's not an obligation, but that's a sort of caution that they would have. The final thing, for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And we talked about this extensively in the last class. If you missed it, do review it. Right? That zakat is an act of worship. It's not a tax. It's not a burden. It's an act of worship. You have to nurture the meaning of seeking the pleasure of Allah, how you'll seek the pleasure of Allah, and what's the right time for the intention? As the text tells us, the basis of the intention in zakat is that you have the intention when you're giving. But it is also valid to have an intention beforehand. So you have wealth, you set aside some money, that this is my zakat money. So if you had the intention when you set it aside, then when you gave it, if you didn't have in mind at all that this is from zakat, that's fine. Right? Someone poor came, you took the money out from your zakat money, but at that time you had nothing in mind that this is from zakat. That's fine because you had the previous intention. You can also make intention after the fact. So Farid comes one day when he's at university and said, Omar Bhai, I decided to take another class, but I don't have money. So Omar just says, okay, here you go. So he gives him $1,000 to enroll in that class and buy the books and so on. But when Farid's walking away, because Omar becomes a really wealthy man, so he says, I have zakat to pay. He says, okay, I'll make that count as zakat. So you can make an intention after the giving, as long as the money has still not been spent by the person you gave it to. Right? And you use your judgment about that. But you can make an after the fact intention as well. Because very often, there's an immediate need, so you give, and it doesn't occur to you that that this is zakat. But the right thing to do is that what moves you is that this is liwajhillah, for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is the intention, this is the definition of zakat. Right? We wanted to look at that as an overview first. It has these 6 aspects to it. Any questions before we continue? Okay. There's a question that giving zakat to relief efforts does not seem to fall under the definition of tamlik. Is this correct? Relief effort is a broad thing, is a broad idea. Right? You can give zakat to relief effort if that relief effort has a zakat fund connected with it. Because zakat is not like other charity. It's a specific type of charity that is taken, that is giving in a specific way to specific people. Right? So it is not sufficient to just say, well, this is the Afghan relief effort, we just give zakat to that. Properly speaking, a charity needs to have a separate zakat fund. And those zakat funds are used only in the ways that are sound for zakat. Because we have obligations on our wealth above and beyond zakat. This is part of the wisdom why it has to be kept separately. Right? Because if you imagine that your only duty is to give zakat, right? So for example, imagine a village where there's drought. Okay? And there's hunger. There's an immediate need that people are hungry. But there's also other needs. They need a school. They need, other infrastructure. Right? They maybe need, in many developing countries, one of the best things you can do is to give people mobile phone access. Right? Like farmers, for example, so that they're able to call and make arrangements to sell their crops. Because in many places, telephone lines tend to be broken and disrupted in many developing countries. So it's, mobile phones, so you hook up that small village to the mobile grid. That's all nice, but zakat is for the immediate human need. All these other social and developmental and relief needs are also obligations upon us. Right? As we emphasized in the last class, the fard on your wealth is not just the specific obligation of zakat, but also the other individual obligations, like providing for your family, etc., that are individual obligations, and there's societal obligations that we're responsible for, right? And this is one of the reasons why you can't. So caution is needed with respect to how one gives zakat. And if one already gave zakat, does one need to investigate whether the money was spent? Normally that would be inappropriate, right? You give someone zakat, you gave someone money, then you go and ask your neighbor, excuse me, did you spend the money that I gave you? Right? It's considered, so you just use your judgment. If it's a short amount of time, the same day, a day or two, then you can assume. But it's been like a month, Someone poor won't keep their money for a month, right? So you just use your judgment, yes or no. Right?
Why do we use, why does it specify, divinely specified in the definition here? Why specifically for zakat does it say that?
Divinely specified because it's mentioned in the Quran.
So, but I mean, in comparison to, let's say, salah, it doesn't say divinely specified action. No?
So why does it mention divinely specified? It just, I mean, it says specified, right? Just to emphasize the point, it's mentioned there for emphasis. The thing that it's divinely specified that for emphasis, that it's muqaddar, right? It's clearly delimited in the Quranic verse, right? It mentions all the categories, which is not common. Right? Normally, details are not mentioned in the Quran, but when details are mentioned in the Quran, and it's interesting, details are normally mentioned in the Quran when something may be disputed. Because you could make all kinds of arguments of spending zakat in all kinds of ways. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specifies that these are the categories. Many other things people are not going to argue about. And what's the time for the prayers? It's mentioned but without details. Why? Because people aren't going to argue about what's zawal. Right? But things that people are going to argue about or dispute or contest, they're mentioned in detail. Inheritance law. Almost all of inheritance law is mentioned explicitly in the Quran. Why? Because people would have all kinds of falsafa, interesting argument and this and that. Times have changed and this has changed and consider this and what about this and what if it's detailed thoroughly in the Quran. Other things that people aren't going to dispute, the details of it aren't mentioned in the Quran. Like Hajj. A lot of the details of Hajj are taken from the Sunnah. Why? Much of the details. Because people aren't going to argue about those details. Right? So that's one of the underlying wisdoms. Or if something people are going to be confused by, like one of the things that is mentioned at length in the Quran is the fiqh and adab related to seeking permission. If someone is resting, if you go to someone's house and knock, what are the adab of that? They mention in a surprising amount of detail in the Quran because most people would be unaware of that. Right? And actually many people, especially in very social societies, disadvantage themselves because they don't keep in mind their rights with respect to others seeking permission. There's an expectation. If anyone comes to your door, you have to answer. In most Arab countries, for example, it's a very strong expectation. But you don't. And the Quran makes it very clear. You have no argument. Doesn't matter who it is. If they knock, it's your right to answer or not to answer. Right? Even though they'll take offense and so on. So, then the author tells us that zakat is obligatory on every free Muslim who is legally responsible and who possesses the zakatable minimum. Right? On wealth that reaches the minimum once a full lunar year has passed, in excess of debts and personal needs. So who must give zakat? You can see it as there being 6 conditions. What are these 6 conditions? Firstly, zakat is due on those who are morally responsible. Morally responsible meaning a sane adult who is Muslim. Right? So a sane adult. Zakat is not due on children's wealth. And there's difference of opinion amongst the schools about this. In some schools, children's wealth is also zakatable. But if this money belongs to the child, zakat is not due on it and cannot be taken on it. Because the basis of a guardian's dealing with their child or the person under their care is that they keep in mind the the direct personal interest of that child. Okay? So zakat is not due on their wealth. Zakat is not only taken from Muslims and only given by Muslims. Who possesses the zakatable minimum, and the definition of the zakatable minimum will come. Right? It is considered either in gold or in silver. In itself, both minimums can be considered the more expansive position is to consider the gold nisab. Right? And fatwa can change. Right? But in the last 10 years, it's gone up almost threefold. The value of gold has gone up an incredible amount in just the last 10 years. Right? Because I remember just not so long, it was around $2,000. Right? Now it's closer, it's well into the 5,000s. And it fluctuates. Right? So, and the silver nisab is relatively low. There's a useful website called enisab.com, and inshallah we'll share the link to that. It's e-nisab, nisab.com. It gives you the daily value of the nisab, both in gold and in silver. Who possesses this zakatable minimum beyond their immediate needs. And the immediate needs are the upcoming month's expenses. Whether it be the recurring expenses or an exceptional expense that they know is coming up. Such as it's end of August and their zakat is due in early August, let's say, and they know that in the next month or so, they'll be paying their tuition fees, for example, for university. That's a known upcoming expense, right? So immediate needs would be their ongoing personal expenses and any known personal expense that's coming up. Okay? So, their grandmother is, has long-term health needs, and the family lives all over the world, but they sort of rotate. Different people go and spend time with her throughout the year. So you know that in a month and a half, you'll be flying yourself and your husband, but you'll be paying for the ticket because your husband will only go with you if you pay the ticket. So you have 2 tickets and money, travel costs and and so on coming up in a month and a half. If you wish, you can deduct that because it's a known upcoming need. Right? But it's best only to deduct the next month's upcoming expenses. Right? Because generally, in calculation, you err on the side of what will be more beneficial for the poor person. And then, to be honest, let's say in 2 months' time, you know that you'll be buying a ticket to go to Guatemala. How much is zakat on $2,000? $50. That's it. Right? And that's part of that bukhl. Right? When it comes to that miserliness, you say, oh my God, let me deduct this and this. But is $50 a major expense? If you consider over years consideration, no. Right? So it's best that something, that the immediate needs that are coming later than a month, even if they're known and clear, it's better not to deduct them. Because you err on the side of what's more beneficial to the poor. But you can, if you so wish. Right? You can.
How are needs defined? Someone could
Personal
say
expenses.
personal expenses, even if it's vacation or travel.
Yeah.
Could be anything.
Anything. But it's better to err on the side of not deducting it. So you know that, the new, you saw the new IMAX. It's so thin, wow. But you're not buying it right now because, in early November, it's only the 21-inch version that's going to be available. The 27-inch version will be available in December, which is more than a month from when you're paying your zakat, but it's an upcoming expense. And so you decide that I'm going to deduct that. Right? And you have other computers, etc., but you want that for your living room. A need is broadly defined. Anything that you get for, religious or worldly benefits, right? In most general sense, right? So the asl is that it's considered, right? Now, if you avoid deducting it, it's better. But you don't have to. Someone said, I'm not going to deduct any of my upcoming expenses from my zakat payment. I understand, it's better. But it's your right to deduct these things. And beyond your debts. Now with debts, and inshallah we'll share some answers on zakat and debts. There's two types. We're in a debt-based consumer society. And it's a big problem. We've just been reading about Korea, right? Consumer debt in Korea is something like 155% of earnings, right? It's crazy, right? But these are the sort of the people have debt, and this is like credit card debts, let alone then you have mortgage debts, and of course credit card debts being problematic Islamically, like riba. They have mortgages, they have this, they have that. If you just have a house, even if it's through a Sharia compliant mortgage, it's still a debt. You're not going to pay zakat for another 30 years, 25 years, right? So when it comes to debts, you deduct the upcoming payments. Because that's what puts you in a situation of immediate need, right? A payment due, if you're earning on a monthly basis, are you worrying right now about the payment that is due next May? No, right? Because that payment you'll make with the earnings you have in May. So the best thing when it comes to debts is only to deduct either debt that is now due upon you. So you got married to Lubna and you borrowed $10,000 from Zubayr, right? And you said you'd pay it within a month. So, and it's been several months, so that debt is due. So you deduct that. Or a debt that is the upcoming payment. Best to deduct the upcoming 1 month's payment, but you can deduct up to a year's worth of payments. But that's it's not the superior thing to do. But in some cases you may need to, right? Because you're going to repay $50,000 in 3 months. So it's your right to deduct that. It's coming up within a year, and it's known. But if you were not to deduct that, that would be much better. And to be honest, how much is zakat on $50,000? It's $1,250. It's not that much. You're going to be paying $50,000 anyways. Like paying $1,000 extra is not going to change very much, and there's great benefit in it. But it's your right to deduct up to a year's worth of zakat payments. But the superior thing to do is to just deduct either debts that are due now or debts that are, or for long-term debts, the upcoming 1 month of payments. And when is zakat payable? Once a zakat year has passed. But a zakat year on all your wealth. There's one zakat year. Right? Once you own the zakatable minimum, your zakat year begins. Then when that year is finished, whatever zakatable amount you have, you pay zakat on that day. Doesn't matter when it was acquired. If you have a wealthy aunt who lives in Cape Town, South Africa, she comes to visit you, and she's really impressed that she never thought you'd become religious. So she gives you $1 million. The night before your zakat is due, you'd give zakat on that. Say, I've barely put it in the bank yet. Doesn't matter. Right? Because you acquired it before the zakat was due. Before the zakat year came in. Regardless of when it was acquired. And this simplifies things as well. In some schools, you, for each stream of wealth, you consider zakat separately, which, if you're an accountant, would make for some really fun times, right? Because each paycheck, you'd consider the zakat on that money separately, right? So if you have 12 paychecks, you have all kinds of, so throughout the year, zakat is getting due on different aspects of your wealth. Imagine if you're a business person, right? It would complicate things significantly. So I know scholars of some of those other schools who tell people that, well, this is our school, but you may want to consider following the Hanafi position. It's much simpler. Alhamdulillah.
If there's an upcoming immediate need, but you later on find out that it's no longer required, and because of that you didn't pay zakat, does the zakat then become due?
Yeah, so if you deducted some upcoming need, right? So for example, you thought that you needed a root canal, and there's an appointment scheduled, and how much does a root canal cost in Canada? Let's just say $1,000. Maybe more, maybe less. I don't know. So but when you went, the doctor said, "Oh, you know what? I looked at the wrong X-ray, and it wasn't for you. It was for someone else." Yeah, it was Zubaydah thought she needed a root canal, but turns out he was looking at Zubayr's X-ray, right? Because the doctor always thinks of Zubayr and Zubaydah, right? So, but your zakat had been due, so you deducted that $1,000 from your zakat due. So you go back and once you realize that you don't have that expense, you pay zakat on that amount that you deducted. So very simplified conceptual calculation. You have your full zakatable wealth, right? Everything that zakat's due on, and you deduct the debts, and you deduct your debts. And we looked at what debts you deduct. Those that are due, and that are already due now, and the upcoming payment of a long-term debt, such as the next installment. And you also deduct immediate expenses, the next month of expenses. You can also deduct other expenses coming up in the year, but it's better not to. Because if you do that, you'll end up without having any zakat paid. And in general, the general principle taken from a number of hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ, and also deduced from the underlying Quranic call to give zakat, is that al-aslu fi zakat an tura'a an yura'a ma huwa aslah lil fuqara. That the basis of zakat is considerate of what would be of greater interest to the poor. So that is your net zakatable wealth, right? Your full zakatable wealth minus debts and immediate expenses. And when is your zakat due? When the zakat year is complete. On what you have on that day. So it's a spot calculation. On that day, what net zakatable wealth do you have? And it's not a tax. You could technically minimize your zakat payments. How? You could do all kinds of legal tricks. You could give away all your wealth to someone, and there's ways of, and it's not so simple to do that, because you actually have to, a gift is only complete when there is possession of the gift, right? Because if I say to Taimur, I gift you my iPhone 5, and he says, I accept, say it, it's not yours. I can take it back and get lost, right? Until you take, a gift is not complete until possession takes place, actual or effective, right? So you can play tricks, but they say hiyalu zakat makruha, right? That legal tricks to avoid zakat or to completely minimize it are prohibitively disliked. It's like you're running away from a duty to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you do not want to fulfill the rights of the poor.
The intention is not.
Yeah, right. So it's problematic. Right? The only time some people would do that, would be if they were in a liquidity crunch. So they do that just as a legal thing, so that, because some scholars held that once zakat is due, you have to pay it immediately. So just as a legalism, when zakat is becoming due, because someone could have a lot of wealth, but they don't have liquidity, like cash liquidity. It might be in stocks, it could be in gold, and in other things that are not, you can't just, it's kind of awkward to give some Apple stock to someone else. Like, it's kind of an awkward transaction. And you don't want to give that away, because you don't. Right? So, you could be in a situation where you don't have the cash right now, you're going to have the cash in January. Now, slight delay of zakat payment is not disliked when there's need. It's in our school, it's recommended to pay zakat right when it's due. Slight delay when there's need is not disliked. Without need, it's disliked. Tanzihan, somewhat disliked. Excessive delay is sinful. But in the Hanafi school, excessive delay is when the delay is 1 year. Like, it takes you into the next zakat payment. That's when it's sinful. But it becomes more and more disliked the more you delay it closer to the next year. That's in our school, but as a relied upon position. But there are positions within our school, minority positions, and also the position of some other schools of Islamic law, that any delay of the zakat from when it's due is sinful. So some people do these legal tricks, and I'm not going to teach you the legal tricks, and don't try to do the tricks if you don't know how to do it. Right? Like, don't try to swallow fire unless you know how you swallow it. Right? They do these legal tricks, but only to get out of awkward situations, like a liquidity crunch. Like, the zakat's legally due on them, but they don't have the cash to pay it right now, or they're traveling, so they do this kind of thing, but they would still pay it when they could. But don't do these kinds of tricks, right? Especially when you don't know what you're doing. That's even worse. It's bad enough to do a trick, and it's even worse to get it wrong, right? Arguably, right? So zakat becomes due when the zakat year has passed, right? So you can look at it this way. Your zakat year begins from when you possess the net zakatable amount. A year later, whatever you have, zakat is due on. That day, if you don't have the net zakatable minimum, how much zakat do you pay? Nothing. So you have $10,000 in gross zakatable wealth, but if you deduct your expenses and your debts, you don't have the zakatable minimum, you don't pay zakat. But that remains your zakat year. Then you just look the next year, let's say it's on the 11th of Dhul Hijjah is your zakat, is your hawl. That's when you got your zakat. Because when you were 14 years old, that day you had a lot of relatives visiting Toronto, so you got a lot of Eid gifts. What do you guys call it? What do you call Eid gifts? In Urdu they call it Eidi. In some Arab countries they call it Eidiyah, right? And there's different terms they use for it, right? But Eid gifts. So when you're 14 and you hit puberty, you got $10,000 worth of zakat of gifts, right? Because you have some really wealthy uncles, right? So that was your zakat year. But that money, you spent, with your parents' permission, and then what happened? But that remains your zakat year, right? Because you set that, you use that money, and then, till you're 24, you never had zakat due, but that remains your zakat year, your zakat due date. What is zakat due on? There's certain categories of things, right? And today we're going to be covering the fiqh itself. Next class we're going to take case studies, right? We're going to take, 7 or so different case studies of different mixes of wealth and so on, just to look at practically how the zakat is paid, right? Applying these principles. Zakat is due on money, right? On your cash at hand, right? Whether it be in in actual cash, or it be in an account, saved in an account, or in your PayPal, or whatever form it may take. Zakat's also due on gold and silver. So gold and silver are considered to be forms of money. Zakat's also due on your investments, right? In a particular way. Right? We'll look at what zakat is due on investments in a bit. Zakat's also due if you have a business on your trade goods. Right? So, for example, if you have, if you make sibhas, right? You have to pay zakat on your inventory. And there's a number of ways of doing the accounting for that. You can do it at the sale price, if you're very generous, right? You can do it at the wholesale price, or you can do it at cost, right? At your cost price, or the price you acquired it for example, right? So there's different ways of calculating that. And that's one of the things we'll be giving you some reading material on as well. And zakat's also due on agricultural produce and animals. Our text does not cover that specifically, right? So what is zakat not due? What is zakat not due on? Is quite straightforward. Anything else. Examples of that: zakat isn't due on jewelry other than gold and silver. And the gold and silver that is in jewelry or in other things, zakat is due on the weight value of the gold and silver. Because is every silver ring of the same cost? No. Right? You get a silver ring from some big designer, it'll be much more expensive. But what you pay zakat on of the gold and silver, it's not the value of the gold and silver item, but rather its weight value. Like how many grams of gold or silver there is, and what's the weight value of that at present market rates. But other jewelry, you have diamond necklaces and platinum rings and all this, they could be more valuable than gold and silver. Zakat is not due on them. Zakat is not due on property or land, even if you have multiple properties, unless you are trading in it, which is two cases. One is if you are a property dealer, right? You buy and sell real estate, right? Then your inventory of real estate holdings that you own, zakat is due on them. It is payable when you sell it. So you bought a house and you're a dealer. So you bought a house just to resell it, but you weren't able to sell it for 2 years. Zakat would be due on it for 2 years, but it will be payable once you sold it. Right? And that's actually a contributor to financial efficiency, because you avoid having just hoarding practices, right? That you buy land just for the sake of it. If you're trading in it, you hold on to it for no reason. If you're purely trading in it, it'd be a problem. But property that you purchase, just as personal belonging, but of course you have in mind that it'll increase in value. You bought property in Milton, to have a second home, because once you have some money, you'll fix it up, and maybe maybe your dad will retire and live there. You might sell your house in Mississauga and move to Milton. So you got it because you had some money, and you invested it there. But it's a personal belonging. You didn't buy it as a trade item. You're not a trader. If you're not a trader, if you buy land or property, it's considered a personal belonging. Then it would only become a trade item when you put it up for sale, specifically. Right? Then it becomes a trade item.
Even if it's up for rent?
What if property or land is up for rent? Then zakat is only due on the earnings from it, with your other money. Right?
So is the zakat due on the sale price or the purchase price? When if you bought it?
No, at the present value. So if you're a trader and you bought this property just as a trade item, took you 3 years to sell it, each year you look at what is the present market value of that property, and zakat would be due on that. Right? And how do you determine present market value? Through acceptable means of calculation. Right? You return to, and market prices are known. What is a similar house in that area sold for, and through acceptable means of property valuation.
Did you say each year? So at the end of every year you calculate it, even if you had it for 3 years, you were trying to sell it, but
yeah.
So you will calculate the zakat due on it at the end of each year, and then pay it at the.
Yeah. So zakat would be due each year, payable once you sell it. Now, if you have a personal property, so you're thinking, let's say you bought that property in Milton, but then you say, I don't like Milton. It's kind of out there. So you're thinking of selling it. Right? Thinking of selling it is not the same as deciding to sell it. So you don't put it up for sale until you decide to sell it. That way zakat won't be due until you make that formal decision. And then zakat is also due on, zakat is not due on business assets. Let's say you have a restaurant. You pay zakat, and the business assets could be quite expensive, right? You have an oven and this, and you have $100,000 of business assets. Do you have to pay zakat on them each year? No, because the business assets are not things that increase. They're not increasing in value. They're actually depreciating in value, right? So what you make on the business, you pay zakat on, but or you have an IT company, do you pay zakat on the computers you own and office supplies and your office property, etc.? No. Right? But your share of ownership of the company, do you pay zakat on? And we'll see how you pay zakat on that separately, inshallah. Then, because the text doesn't go into so many details about that. So this was the look at who pays zakat. Now, the text defines for us what the zakatable minimum is, both in gold value and silver value, right? And the footnote gives us, the text would talk about the weight value in old measures, right? And there's difference of deduction of how that translates into gold, into grams or ounces in contemporary calculations. The e-nisab site gives us a number of calculations which are sound, and we'll share that on the forum, right? Zakat on stock, right? Like if you have ownership in a company, right, or you have investments in stock. Stock can be considered in two ways, right? And you can complicate it significantly, but zakat is not something. Zakat is meant to be like every teaching of Islam. The the rulings are interpreted in a way that the average person can calculate it without requiring undue effort nor some specialized expertise. So, for example, rulings related to menstruation, you could go to a doctor and do tests and check what type of bleeding this is, but that would complicate things. So Sharia gives there's outward signs that you follow that enable anyone to make a straightforward judgment. So stock, there could be all kinds of ways of analyzing it financially and this and that, but you come up with very complicated calculation that you'd require accountants to help you with. The straightforward way of looking at zakat, and there's contemporary discussion amongst the ulama about this, but is that if your primary motive in your acquisition of stock is trade, you're buying and selling stock, then you practically consider it like a trade good. So you'd be paying zakat on the full value of the stocks that you own. Right? So you're not keeping it as a long-term investment from which you're looking at the dividend returns, etc. And at some future date you may or may not sell it, right? And that's meant to be what stocks are for, right? It's not meant to be primarily speculative. It's meant to be that you're investing in a company seeking to get returns. But we have a very skewed financial market, right? Unfortunately, right? And it's an imbalance. But if you are investing in the stocks, right, not just for buying and selling, then zakat is due only on the zakatables of the company, right? Your cash, receivables, inventories, right? And there's ways of calculating that, and we'll share that on the forum. There's some answers on zakat on stock, and there's a useful website, inshallah, which I'll share that gives you the basis of calculating that. So there's two ways. You can treat it as a trade item, if you're just buying and selling the stocks, or as an investment item, then it's as if you have a share of the ownership, then you pay zakat on those things within the company's that extent of the company's financial assets that are zakatable, cash, receivables, inventories, etc. And there's ways of knowing that, and you don't have to do it exactly, but you can go by industry averages and so on. We'll look at that. And you pay zakat on all your different categories of zakat. You have some cash, you have some gold, you have some investment, you have some inventory. You don't pay zakat on each one separately, you calculate it all together. Right? And the nisab, the zakatable minimum, is considered on all the zakatable wealth considered together. Zakat is also due on livestock and on agricultural produce, but we won't go into that. If you have agricultural produce or livestock, calculate it. Now, zakat on businesses, a practical thing is, the first time you calculate these kinds of things, consult. Check that you're doing it right. It'll give you clarity and surety that you're doing it right. So the first time, consult, make sure you're doing it right. The second time, you may just want to confirm. And that's a simple thing in life. Don't have this radical individualism. I'll do it myself. And then you overwhelm yourself, you find it difficult. First time, consult. Make sure you understood it right. Make sure you calculated it right. Second time, just you confirm, and then from that, unless things change, you know exactly what you're doing. And that's why they say مَا خَابَ مَنِ اسْتَشَارَ. The Prophet reported that. Whoever consults will never feel remorse. They have clarity. And there's 8 categories of zakat that are mentioned in the text. You can look at them. in the text, they're mentioned in the Quranic verse. These are taken directly from the Quranic verse, Surah At-Tawbah, verse 60. The basis of all of them is that the person is poor or needy. Poverty is the underlying consideration, except for the state-appointed zakat collector. But the zakat collector can only be the one that is state-appointed. Sister Yasmin can decide that, you know what, I want to save up for college by starting a zakat agency. Right? So she collects zakat, keeps 5% for herself. I'm a zakat collector. Because that opens the doors for abuse. And that's only the state-appointed zakat collector. But even with the state-appointed zakat collector, it's better for the government to pay them outside of the zakat funds. And again, these are things that you have to be careful with charities. Many charities take all kinds of overhead expenses out of zakat, and that's completely wrong. Right? You don't have to give to each of these categories or to several of these categories in the Hanafi school. You can give to one person from one category if you so wish. Right? And there's different opinion amongst schools about that. In some schools, you have to give to at least a number of people from a number of categories, but that complicates things. In the Hanafi school, one person from one category would be sufficient, or you can distribute them amongst these categories. These categories are also useful, actually, or of legal consequence, if someone tells you to give zakat in a specific way. Right? Someone gives you zakat, $5,000, give this to someone in debt. And then you have to give it to that specified category. You can't say, oh, well, I'll just give it to someone else. No. If someone specifies one of these categories for you to give zakat, you cannot go and give it to someone else. Right? Or if you collect it on the basis that you're going to give this to someone who's needy, you can't go and give it to someone who's in another category. Unless they fulfill, because often people can fit into more than one of these categories. Who can't you give zakat to? We looked at that, right? And the principles of that. Right? Parents, spouse, children, or in any situation where there isn't a transfer of ownership. You can't give zakat for charitable projects, etc. There's a really good answer on that in the Sunni Path Answers. I believe I've seen Suhail Hanif, which we will share as well. Now, there's a few matters related to payments that we wanted to remind you of. One is, don't delay. Right? Don't delay your payment. Right? Don't delay the payment of your zakat. Right? It's best to pay it either on time, right when it's due, so you're ready. You've done the calculations, this and that beforehand, so when it's due you pay it, or to hasten paying it. And in the Hanafi school you can even pay years in advance if you so wish, as long as you make sure that you end up paying all that is due upon you. Remember that transfer of ownership to a poor Muslim is a condition for validity. Be careful with charities. Right? Firstly, that they have sound policies, right? Because there's charities that they'll collect zakat, but they don't know how to disperse it. Sometimes, like there's one case, this charity collected money for the earthquake relief in Pakistan in 2005, I believe the earthquake was. 2008, they sent they emailed asking, we still have, there's a large amount of money, like $20,000, $30,000 that we never came around to giving. Right? Because they're not efficient, they don't have clear policies. And a sign that they're not efficient is the fact that they don't have policies. That, well, we just identify needs and we give them. Right? It's your right. Having a good opinion of others does not preclude having caution in your dealings with them. And that's, again, our deen is a deen of balance, right? Having a good opinion of people does not mean that we're foolish. Right? We enter into transactions, we have a good opinion. We only enter into the transactions because you have a good opinion of the person. But you have caution, you take the means, you work according to contracts, you work with people with clarity, with respect to their um, you know, to their situation. So with charities, make sure that they have the simple thing: do they have zakat policies? Ask to see the zakat policies. Right? Ask some questions about it, such as, do they keep zakat funds separate from other funds? How do they spend the zakat funds? Right? Because a lot of charities, they'll just spend the zakat funds on anything. And that's a problem. Right? That's a problem. Because if you just look at it at a common sense level, a lot of what charities spend their money on is not, strictly speaking, fulfilling the needs of the poor person. So you have, for example, an Islamic hospital, some Islamic charity builds a hospital. So the hospital benefits the poor. Not strictly speaking. The poor person is benefited by you helping them pay for their medical needs. But you build a new ward and you put in high-tech equipment. Does the high-tech equipment benefit the poor person? Not directly. Right? Not directly. And actually, a lot of these kinds of spendings, if you know about development issues, right? People, it's more, it looks nicer. The flashy spending looks nicer. Right? So you're installing some really high-tech well in some little village. Right? So you spend all this money on the well. The well will benefit the poor. Not necessarily. Zakat is for the fulfillment of the immediate needs of the poor person. We have other societal responsibilities as well. Building that hospital is it's a communal obligation. But that's not what zakat is for. So be careful, right? And it's also just not being, any charity that cannot make this simple kind of distinction is not worthy of your zakat, right? So be cautious with charities. Be cautious with individuals too, right? Because we need to have a sense of accountability. I know a number of times, these are people with conscience. People have asked, someone gave me zakat money, can I spend it on myself? Because I'm poor. And they're just legally poor. They're not actually like in need. And the person wouldn't have given them zakat if they thought that they were going to spend this. I have some debts. Someone actually asked, someone gave me zakat to give to someone poor, but I have student loans. Can I just use it for myself? And they have a good job, but they have student loans. And so be careful. Right? And the basis is that you cannot use money that you've been given, whether it's zakat or charity, because the general effect, you'll give it to someone else, unless you seek the explicit permission of the person giving it. Right?
So even if it's, let's say, it's a hospital who does have clearly defined policy and who is actually spending it on the poor patient.
Yeah, so it's not that you can't give it to a hospital, but there's a right way of doing it, right? You give it to a hospital if they have zakat policies. So what happens? They don't just deduct a poor person's expense from their account, but someone's needy, they either give it to that poor person to make the payment themselves, or they have an agent, they have someone appointed, to make, to give the payment on behalf of the poor person. And that actually leads to accountability as well. Right?
So is the payment to the organization considered your zakat, or until they actually pass it on?
No, you're considered to fulfill your responsibility once you give it to a trustworthy agent, right? Whether a charity or individual. Zakat can also be given in kind. So you have a computer store, so you have inventory. So you can give computers as zakat, but at present market value, not at, so you have old computers, so you give them at the purchase price? No. Right? It has to be at present market value.
Is that only on things with jewels?
No, it could be anything. So let's say someone has a hijab store. They could give zakat as hijabs at the present market value of those hijabs. But one looks at what would be of more benefit to the poor person. Right? Any questions here? Yeah. So there's a question that my dad has a huge garden, but he gives his veggies to friends and family, but it's a really big garden. Does he pay zakat on that? He doesn't sell anything. Okay. We'll take that question in the forum and do a little digging, right? And there's many sources through which you can dig in English as well, right? So it's a good question. And what kind of agricultural produce? If you have a little home garden, like you have, at what stage do you have to give zakat on agricultural produce? Why is there zakat drives in Ramadan? It seems like people are looking at their zakatable wealth that they have in Ramadan and paying 2.5% on it. There's nothing specifically recommended in paying zakat during Ramadan. The specific recommendation is that you give zakat immediately as it's due, right? Without delay. There is a general recommendation to give in charity in Ramadan, and this is something that's often understood. But if a poor person comes to you 2 months before Ramadan and you can assist them, should you say, no, I'm going to give, you have $100 set aside? Would there be greater reward in assisting the person there and then, or say, okay, you know what, I'll help you in 2 months? What is better? Yeah, the immediate assistance is greater in reward. Right? So when you paying your zakat when it's due is superior than you're delaying it to Ramadan. You're assisting someone when they have immediate need is of greater reward than you're delaying the assistance till Ramadan. As is common sense. And this is very often misunderstood. So this is why it's a good question.
If you said if one can actually pay zakat in advance, but let's say because of that payment, the person never reaches the nisab for let's say years, because he's always paying.
No, so what about paying zakat in advance? Zakat is due. You still have a due date for Ramadan, for your zakat. But you can pay zakat in advance. So if someone wants to pay zakat in Ramadan, the correct way of doing so is, one, if you don't remember when your zakat due date is, you could just say, well, let's consider it to be the first of Ramadan, just as a practical measure. But if you want to be paying your zakat in Ramadan, the superior thing to do is to pay it in advance in Ramadan. So let's say your zakat is due at the end of Dhul Hijjah, because that's when you collected all your Eid gifts. Because all your uncles are wealthy, but they gave you promissory notes. They paid the first of the month after Eid, right? They all work for the same company, right? Irfan Enterprises, right? So, but you want to pay zakat in Ramadan, you shouldn't wait till the next Ramadan comes to pay zakat. Pay it in advance, but when your zakat actually becomes due, just make a calculation to ensure that you are in fact paying the full amount.
But if you don't have the nisab, because you paid it in advance, so let's say you're very borderline to your nisab and you're paying it in advance.
Doesn't matter. So what if you had less? Is it haram to pay zakat if you have just under the nisab? No. If you wanted to, it wasn't due on you, you just paid it anyway. Is it haram to pay in charity when you don't have the nisab? No. It'd be haram to give in charity if it leads you to not fulfill your obligatory financial dues. You don't pay your rent, you don't provide for your family, you don't repay your debts on time. Why? Because I'm giving in charity. That's what's haram. But someone's poor and they want to assist others, that's up to them. Right? That's up to the person. Okay, so in terms of giving zakat in kind and the hijab example, would one fulfill conditions of zakat by leaving the hijabs at the masjid for sisters to take? No. You have to be reasonably sure that the person you're giving it to fulfills the condition of being zakat eligible. Right? If someone leaves his hijab, someone wealthy comes and say, I needed a 70-second hijab. Here it is. But the person is not zakat eligible. Right? You have to be reasonably sure that the person is zakat eligible. Which is the next issue actually that comes up. Right? The author tells us that in terms of errors in giving, that if one pays zakat after having made an honest effort to ensure that the recipient was eligible, and then one finds out that the recipient was not eligible, then it is valid, and they don't have to pay it again. Right? Unless of course this doesn't apply in our times, unless you gave it to your own slave. Because the slave's wealth belongs to the owner, just as if you gave it, you didn't end up giving it. Right? So, what is implicit in this statement is that you have to make an honest effort to ensure that the person you're giving it to is zakat eligible. You can trust their word. Someone comes to them, I'm in need, you can take them at face value. And you can take them at face value. Or if there's clear signs of poverty, or someone tells you that they're poor, right? Can you please help so and so out? They're in a difficult situation. Okay? You don't have to ask the person, are you zakat eligible? You don't need to pry into their private affairs. You don't have to show financial statements, right? And there is a balance between making sure of eligibility and prying into someone's private affairs. Right? And this is a delicate balance for Muslim charities as well. Because there's many people who make false claims. But one needs to come up with a dignified balance between being straightforward, having good opinion of other people, and of reasonable caution that respects the dignity and privacy of an individual. Okay. And that's a matter of policy, and those things one should, if one has a charity, one should inquire about what are best practices, etc., and choose the best practices. And those things one should consult. Very often, scholars who have experience in dealing with these kinds of things will know of these kinds of zakat policies and so on. And there's some Muslim charities that have good zakat policies. Alhamdulillah.
If one does have, let's say, one's calculated,
And there's some that have terrible zakat policies, to be honest.
someone's eligibility, would it be better to gauge their wealth based on the value of gold, and then gauge your own once based on silver?
So what is the nisab? There's difference of opinion in our times. What is the nisab for zakat? Some say that in judging someone's eligibility as a recipient, you consider gold. And in terms of your own obligation to pay zakat, you consider the nisab of silver. But that's inconsistent. Because in that way, you could give zakat and receive it at the same time. Technically. Right? That's legally inconsistent. So legal consistency, the fatwa that would appear to be that one would consider, the general fatwa would be that to consider the gold nisab, both in giving and in receiving. It's easier, it's more consistent, etc. Now, if someone wants to be cautious, they should give even if they have the silver nisab, and they should only seek zakat if they're below the silver nisab. That is, caution as a giver and caution as a recipient. But as a broad fatwa, the gold nisab would be considered, because someone who only has a couple of thousand in the bank is considered to be relatively close to the edge. But there's a lot of discussion on that. Now, in terms of errors in giving, in general, there's two types of errors in the Sharia. there's an excusable error and a non-excusable error. And what is considered excusable or not depends on circumstance. When it comes to zakat, and also but one also has to be aware what is the consequence. Like sometimes the excuse will lift sin, but will not lift responsibility. So it's like my friend that I probably mentioned before, who prayed the best prayer of his life, wearing a long shirt, without wearing trousers underneath. But when he got up, he noticed that he wasn't wearing anything underneath. Like it's like a long, kurta, like it's a long Indian shirt. So he thought he was covered. He didn't look, because he was praying with so much concentration. He didn't notice that he wasn't wearing the trousers underneath. Now that error may be excusable in terms of lifting sin, but does that mean you don't have to pray anymore? No, you have to pray it again. Right? So, but in general, the excuse sometimes will lift just the sinfulness, but you still are considered to have prayed naked, legally naked, so you have to pray it again. But with zakat, there's a distinction. Right? If you gave it to someone and it was an excusable error, you don't have to pay it again because you did make the payment. And there's a difference between you forgot to pay your zakat, and if you forgot, that might be excusable in terms of sin, right? Or you had wahm, right? You normally pay your zakat, but you have an alarm on your computer, but your computer crashed and it was being repaired those days, so the alarm never went off, and you assume that you must have paid it, but then you realize you didn't. That lifts the sin, but you still have to pay it. But the difference here is if you paid the zakat and there was an excusable error, right? You paid it to someone who deceived you. So Farid was actually taking the zakat money not because he was poor, but because he wanted to go and give some money in charity to someone else. Right? That's a problem. Right? There, you're not considered. You're considered to have done your duty because you made an honest effort to ensure that the recipient was eligible. And you don't have to pry or ask for financial statements or anything like that. Someone claims that they're eligible, unless you have strong reason not to believe them. Right? But it's not excusable that you made no effort, right? You need to pay your zakat, so you're kind of like practical person. Say, okay, here you go. You just give someone some money, or you leave some hijabs in the masjid. Right? Anyone could pick that up. No one may pick it up. They might just put it, oh, there's some hijabs here, let's put it in the hijab bin, right? And it's just being used. It's not being taken by someone in need, right? So that's the general principle here. There's some contemporary implications to this. What if you gave zakat to a charity, believing that they were handling the zakat properly, which is a reasonable expectation, especially if you didn't know otherwise. Right? Once you know otherwise, that most charities have, at present, most Muslim charities don't have zakat policies, then you have to act, then you're responsible for that knowledge. But is it a reasonable expectation to expect a charity to have sound policies? Yes, it is. Unless you know otherwise. So let's say you gave your charity for many years to some national organization, but they were spending the money on their administrative expenses, on masjid expansion, on repairing the dome. Some local, some Canadian Islamic organizations were spending over 60% of their zakat on administrative and overhead expenses. But you didn't know that. Do you have to repay the zakat for all those years? No. You are considered to have paid the zakat because you gave it with a reasonable with an honest effort. You trusted the charity. But, so retroactively you gave zakat to a charity that didn't have sound policies, you're not legally bound to repay it. And this is something I've consulted a number of senior ulama regarding. Right? So they used it for da'wah efforts, etc. MSA National made a call, and I don't know if they still do it. If they do, give them advice without creating fitna. To use zakat for some da'wah purposes, that's not an eligible form of zakat. But you didn't know what they're spending it on. You gave it to them because they asked for zakat. Then you don't have to go back and repay. But going forward, you need to be careful that a charity or an agency or an individual that you're giving zakat to is in fact going to give it in a sound manner. Right? And the simple thing is to ask, what are their policies, how they would give it, whom would they give it to, when they would give it. And those are 4 basic questions. Do they have zakat policies? And it would be good to see them. Number 2, how they would give it, to whom they would give it, and when they would give it. Because the basis is zakat is supposed to be given right away. And people do funny things, right? There's this idea that, why don't we set up zakat funds that become endowments? So we get hundreds of millions of dollars into a zakat fund, and we just give out the returns. Well, firstly, returns aren't guaranteed. Number 2, you're only giving a small amount out of that, right? And there's many, many problems. And there's some zakat funds that people set up like this, like in the Gulf and elsewhere. Financial crisis came, most of the value of the zakat funds wiped out. They're never going to be able to give out the amount that was ever put into it. Okay? And that's all. That's things that you could use charity funds for, not zakat funds. Okay? So that's one of the contemporary aspects.
Just a question, it might be relevant right now, but does the same ruling apply for OT as well? For if you give to an organization to do slaughtering on your behalf, and then find out later their policies?
Sorry?
For udhiyah, for Qurban.
Yeah.
Does the same apply, because that's also...
Yeah, so what about udhiyah? One should be careful, right? That there's scams, especially on the internet. There's all kinds of scams. Right? You should be like, how do you know? Do you have any reason to know that these people are trustworthy? So be careful, right? You could assume validity, but do you think there'd be the same benefit in someone actually doing it on your behalf, or someone just taking the money and putting it in their Egyptian bank account? Right? So be careful. The discussion on gold nisab or silver nisab returns to what would be considered a state of need. And the argument for the gold nisab is that someone doesn't let's say the gold nisabs, I'm not sure exactly how it is right now. Someone has $700 in the bank account, and they have the upcoming month to look at, or the month after. They're still on the verge of, they're in a state of poverty. Things are, they're one crisis out of distress. So that's why, the gold nisab would be considered. Though, in terms of poverty, we talked about what caution is. Wallahu alam. There's a lot of discussion on this. Like senior ulama differ on this matter.
People who are actually eligible for zakat, who are actually poor, what would be the right mannerism to actually approach, or let people know that they're actually in
Yeah. What is the adab of being the adab of the poor person? The adab of the poor person is not to ask unless one is genuinely needy or in distress. Right? The right state is that if one can contentedly remain patient, this is of the best of states that one can be in. Right? Right? Not to ask. And this is called iffa and ta'affuf. Iffa is to have dignified restraint, and ta'affuf is holding oneself to dignified restraint. Right? And that is the best state for someone to be in if one can be content. If one can be content. If it's overwhelming, right, then it is better to ask so that one does not feel overwhelmed. Because that harms one in one's deen and it harms one emotionally as well. So if one is able to remain poor and patient, but part of patience is to take the means of getting out of that. Right? To take the means of getting out of that. You have self-empowerment, right? That one goes and seeks work, etc. One seeks the means of getting out of the situation oneself. But if one is in a desperate state or in a distressful state, especially if one is responsible for family, etc., or there's going to be consequent harms that state of poverty that one is mired in could lead to the breakup of one's marriage, or child protection services taking one's children, all kinds of things could happen, right? Then it may be better to ask. But if one is in a situation where one does need to ask, then one asks with dignity and with restraint. One asks with dignity and with restraint. And for example, it's better to have someone, instead of asking publicly, one asks privately. One asks people who could help one indirectly. Right? You don't put on Facebook, I'm $2,000 in debt, can you help me out? Right? And I've seen people do that kind of thing, right? But it's better to ask someone privately who could assist one. But it is sunnah to seek out these kinds of people, right? Right? That people think of يَحْسَبُهُمُ النَّاسِ أَغْنِيَاء مِنَ التَّعَفُّفِ. That people think of them as being without need because of their dignified restraint. And those people one should seek out. And who are they likely to be? For example, if you're looking here in Canada, recent immigrants, for example, right? They may well not have a job, they could be in a very tight situation. Someone who's just recently moved to the city. Someone who works in lines of works that don't give good salaries. Very often, sadly, scholars, Quran teachers, in people in fulfilling other religious duties, they're paid terribly, right? So those are the kinds of people one finds out about in dignified ways, and that's a duty for the community to make sure that such people, their needs are taken care of. Students of knowledge who are studying overseas, they may not ask, they may be in desperate situations, right? But one seeks out to help them. Someone in another line of work where they may not be paid well. Okay? Many people who are engaged in different types of activism or social work, right? Who work for non-profits, etc., who may be in very difficult situations. So one seeks out such people to help them. Okay? And one should give with balance, such that you give enough so that the person is no longer immediately needy. Right? One does not give someone more than the nisab unless they have family, right? So you consider it's not just the person ends up with more than nisab, but if they have a lot of kids, especially older kids, and they have the kids have upcoming expenses, then you could give more than a nisab. Right? So you don't give someone $6,000 unless that would take care of debts, unless they have family to take care of and family expenses to consider, etc. But it is recommended to give one zakat such that one takes the person out of need. Right? Helping one person, if you have $100, instead of giving it to $25 to 24 people, giving $100 to someone, which makes a bigger difference in their life, may be superior. Right? But that's where there's also the consideration of pooling zakat funds so that it can be given in a more impactful manner. And we looked at that last class. Right? Delay of zakat is disliked. So there's a few matters of preference. You don't delay your zakat. Transferring zakat, the basis is that you pay it locally. And you pay zakat locally unless people overseas are more in need. Right? But then there's balancing considerations. The local people who are local and needy have the rights of immediacy, and the people who are overseas have the rights of greater neediness. So it's not an either or. If you have zakat funds, you spend some locally and send some overseas. But taking care of immediate needs is a strong religious consideration. It's an error to say, well, Muslims in Muslim countries are more poor. Yes, that's true, but zakat begins locally, right? And that's a major consideration. One also looks at who would be of greater benefit, right? And one of them is, for example, people giving that would be transformative, right? Giving to students of knowledge, for example, giving to teachers of knowledge, because then you're, assisting in the public good. If you have relatives who are needy, they have greater rights over you than strangers, right? If you have neighbors who are needy, right? People in one's local community, right? So these are matters of preference. And one similar, so there's not an absolute that everyone should give zakat in one category. Right? You may have run into someone who's in a situation of need and they have some ongoing need, and you're assisting that individual person. And so these are matters of preference. Now, next class, what we're going to do, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, is we're going to look at some case studies related to the payment of zakat, just to have clarity in terms of applying these principles. There's a question: is it understood that zakat does not go to criminals? I mean, don't be funding gangsters if you know they're gangster, but that's not one of the criteria. Because if a criminal is needy, you can give zakat to them. Should you give zakat to them? That depends on the circumstance. Because someone may be trying to get out of crime, right? So there's no specific thing. You may be in a country where prisoners are really poorly treated. So there's some zakat project to assist prisoners to be able to take vocational classes, for example. There's a beautiful foundation that actually accepts zakat, called Taiba Foundation in the US, www.taibafoundation.org, run by a trustworthy scholar, actually one of the Seeker's Guidance teachers, Shaykh Rami and Sur, and they take zakat, and they have proper zakat policies. And for a prison education program, and it's disbursed properly, right? It enables Muslims in prison to learn the deen. And there's people who graduated from these programs, and when they've come out, and there's actually been featured news articles about this, they've come out and they're now holding imam positions, chaplain positions, after learning the deen and becoming scholars in jail through this, that is transformative giving. They were criminals, they're in jail, right? It's like one of the great imams of Tasawwuf said, "Kunna lusus فأصبحنا khusus." That we used to be criminals, but now we've become of the elect, right? Because they say, sometimes the same skills that it requires to be a criminal, your intelligence and dedication and hard effort, could make someone of the most virtuous. Okay? Just it depends where it's directed. It's like I have a good friend who all of us would always say that Alhamdulillah, you're religious and you keep good company. Because if you weren't, you'd be a real danger to society. Right? Because this guy was really sharp. Right? Always he'd know the way out of problems and this and that. I'd be like, Alhamdulillah, you're with the good and not against it. Because he could have been an agent of mass destruction. Alhamdulillah. So that's our class for today. We'll be reviewing these principles in the next class by looking at a number of case studies. So do come to that class. That's an important class. If you have follow-up questions, don't hesitate to ask them in the forum, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And we're close to the end of the book. We have just a few classes on zakat and a few classes on hajj and a few classes on fasting, and then we'll be beginning something else after that, which is to be announced. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا والحمد لله رب العالمين.